Don't worry. We'll trick her like always. My mother's voice came through the half-open door, low and certain the way she spoke when she had already made up her mind. My father laughed quietly. Mallory asked which illness they would use this time because apparently that was a decision requiring discussion. They settled on a heart condition. Emergency bypass surgery. $235,000 wired before midnight. I was standing in my parents' hallway with a bottle of champagne and a small cake. I had just been promoted to Director of Financial Investigations and wanted to surprise them with the news. I had spent 4 years believing every emergency, every hospital bill, every tearful phone call. I had given them $78,400 without asking a single question. Standing in that hallway, I did not walk through the door. I pulled out my phone and hit record. If you're new here, this channel is where real stories like this one live. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I work at a company called Vantage Ledger Forensics based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. We help businesses figure out where their money went: embezzlement, falsified records, tax evasion, payment fraud. My job is to look at numbers and find the thing that doesn't belong. A mismatched date, a duplicated transaction code, a signature that curves slightly differently on page 3 than it does on page 1. Most people wouldn't notice those things. I notice everything. That's what I'm paid for. What I was not paid for, what I had never once thought to apply those same skills to, was my own family. My father, Russell, used to run a small building supply store on the east side of town. The business closed after a few bad years, and he retired early quietly, the way he did most things. My father was not a loud man. He didn't yell or make demands. He would simply sit at the head of the dinner table with a particular expression on his face, something between disappointment and patience, and that look alone had been enough to shape most of my decisions growing up. When my father seemed let down, I assumed it was something I had done. I spent years trying to fix a feeling I couldn't name handed to me by a man who never once explained what he actually wanted. My mother, Corinne, was the one who spoke. She was warm in the way that felt genuine until you noticed she was always keeping score. She talked about family loyalty the way other people talk about religion, with complete conviction and zero room for disagreement. She would remind me often that a daughter who had done well had a responsibility to the people who raised her. She never said it like a threat. She said it like a fact, the way you'd tell someone that water runs downhill. My sister Mallory was 28 and had always been the one my parents worried about, fussed over, and quietly excused. She had started a wedding planning company a few years earlier called Velvet Pine Events, and from the outside it looked successful. A nice office, a good car, a polished Instagram full of flower arrangements, and candle-lit reception halls. What none of us knew, or what I chose not to look at too closely, was that the whole thing is built on borrowed money and delayed consequences. Mallory had been paying old debts with new clients' deposits, running the kind of scheme that works right up until the moment it doesn't. But I didn't see any of that at the time. I saw a younger sister who was trying hard and hitting bad luck, and I believed that because believing it was easier than the alternative. Over 4 years, my family came to me with emergencies the way other families share holiday recipes regularly, confidently, and always at exactly the wrong moment. My father needed surgery for a spinal injury after a fall. My mother needed her gallbladder removed, and the insurance had apparently refused to cover it. Mallory was being sued by a client and needed a lawyer immediately. The furnace in my parents' house broke down in the middle of winter. A great-aunt needed a deposit for a care facility, or she'd lose her spot. Each story arrived fully formed, emotionally weighted, and time-sensitive in a way that made asking questions feel like cruelty. I never asked. I just sent the money. Over 4 years, I transferred a total of $78,400 to various accounts in various amounts for various reasons, that I now know were almost entirely invented. I had told myself that requesting receipts or medical records from your own parents meant you didn't trust them. What I hadn't understood yet was that trust, when it goes unexamined, becomes something other people can spend. I had been working towards something for a long time. There was a property I had my eye on, an older house with a small detached workshop in the back. My plan was to buy it, renovate the workshop, and eventually use it as the home base for my own forensic accounting firm. I'd been building toward that slowly, carefully setting money aside every month, the way you'd tend to something that needed time to grow. By the week all of this happened, I had managed to save a little over $260,000. That same week, I was promoted to Director of the Financial Investigations Division at Vantage Ledger Forensics. We had just wrapped up a case involving a mid-sized logistics company and several $1 million that had been quietly redirected over 18 months. I had been the one to find it. The promotion felt like confirmation of something I had worked toward for years, and I wanted to share it with people I loved. So I bought a bottle of champagne and a small cake and drove to my parents' house to surprise them. I didn't call ahead. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. I stepped into the hallway, and that's when I heard Mallory's voice from the dining room. She was crying, or something close to it, and saying that the creditors had started threatening legal action. Several clients had figured out that their wedding deposits were gone. The numbers she kept repeating added up to around $235,000, the amount needed to temporarily stop the lawsuits and cover unpaid payroll taxes. Mallory wasn't just in debt. She was on the edge of a criminal investigation. My mother's response was immediate and completely calm. She said they couldn't sell the house because it had been refinanced twice and there was nothing left in it. She said there was no credit left to borrow against. She said not to worry. She said they would handle it the same way they always had. And then she said the words I had been carrying since the moment I heard them. Don't worry. We'll trick her like always. She laid it out plainly. I had just been promoted, which meant I almost certainly had money saved. They would tell me my father had suffered a serious cardiac event and needed emergency bypass surgery. My father would clutch his chest and speak in a weakened voice. My mother would explain that the insurance company had denied the claim on a technicality. Mallory would cry and beg me to save our father's life. They had already identified the name of a real cardiac center in Denver, Rockland Cardiac Institute, and planned to produce documents using its letterhead. The payment portal would be set up under Mallory's control. If I wanted to speak with a doctor directly, they would hire someone to take the call. If I insisted on visiting the hospital, my father would claim to have been transferred to a private facility that didn't allow visitors. Then they started talking about the times before. The spinal injury my father had never actually had. The gallbladder surgery my mother had never undergone. The lawsuit against Mallory that had been invented from nothing. My father was the one who brought up the conference. He said it almost fondly, the time Brenna left a professional conference in the middle of a presentation and wired $12,000 to us in under an hour. He laughed when he said it. Not a guilty laugh, a satisfied one. I stood in that hallway and felt something I can only describe as the floor dropping out from under a house I had lived in my whole life. Every memory I had of my family was suddenly two things at once, the version I had believed and the version that had been true underneath. The surgeries, the crises, the tearful phone calls, all of it had been performance rehearsed and refined over 4 years because it kept working. My hands found my phone before I had consciously decided to use it. I opened the voice memo app and pressed record. It was the most automatic thing I had ever done, the professional instinct that kicks in before the emotional one catches up. I stood in that hallway and recorded every word. When I had enough, I slipped back out the front door without making a sound. I sat in my car with the champagne on the passenger seat and the cake on the floor and listened to the recording from the beginning. My mother's voice came through the speaker, small and clear. "We'll trick her like always." I listened to it twice. The grief was there, enormous and immediate, but underneath it something else was forming, something cold and focused that I recognized from work. It was the feeling of knowing exactly where the fraud was before you decided what to do about it. I needed more than a recording. If I walked back in and confronted them right now, they would deny everything, reframe the conversation, and find a way to make me the problem. I had seen that dynamic in enough cases to know how it ended. What I needed was to watch them go all the way through with it, document every step, and make sure I had protected my accounts before any of this reached a point where they could access my money without my knowledge. Before I drove back, I did one thing. I looked up the official contact number for Rockland Cardiac Institute directly from their website and saved it in my phone. I didn't know exactly what form the next few hours would take, but I knew the name of the hospital they had chosen, and I wanted to be ready. I drove around the block twice. Then I parked in front of the house, got out, and walked to the front door. This time I let it close loudly behind me. I stepped into the dining room carrying the champagne and announced that I had wanted to surprise them. I said I'd been promoted. I smiled and set the bottle on the table. The shift in the room was immediate, though they tried to cover it. My mother hugged me, and before she had even let go, she asked how much the salary increase was. My father, who had just been laughing about the conference, looked at me with the measured expression I had spent my childhood trying to decipher, and asked whether the promotion came with equity or a bonus structure. Mallory wanted to know if this meant I was still planning to buy that property, the one with the workshop. I said I hadn't decided yet what I'd do with any of it. I watched my parents exchange a look over my shoulder. Less than 10 minutes later, my father pressed his hand flat against his chest and lowered himself heavily into his chair. His breathing changed. His voice when he spoke had gone thin and strained. My mother was on her feet immediately, positioning herself beside him, her hand on his arm, her face arranged into an expression of controlled fear. Mallory stood near the doorway, with her arms folded tight across her body, already beginning to cry. I moved toward my father and said we needed to call an ambulance. My mother stopped me. She said he had a private physician who was already monitoring the situation and that taking him to a public emergency room could actually make things worse given the complexity of his condition. She said it with such practiced authority that if I hadn't been standing in that hallway 40 minutes earlier, I might have believed her completely. Instead, I sat down across from my father and watched him perform and understood for the first time that this was not a family in crisis. This was a rehearsal I had never been invited to witness. I was the only one in the room who didn't know the lines, and until today, that had been entirely by design. I made my decision. I would not confront them tonight. I would not give them any reason to suspect that I knew. What I would do was go home, go through 4 years of transaction records, and build the kind of case that didn't leave room for a counter-narrative. I had been a financial investigator for long enough to know that the truth documented properly was the only thing that couldn't be talked out of existence. I stayed for another 20 minutes, said I was tired from the workday, and hugged each of them before I left. My father's hug lasted a second longer than usual. Standing there with his arms around me, I thought about the recording sitting on my phone and about every emergency I had dropped everything to respond to, and about the sound of his laugh when he remembered that conference. I drove home with the champagne still unopened on the passenger seat. I got home a little after 9 that night and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and 4 years of bank statements pulled up across 3 browser tabs. I had done this exact thing hundreds of times at work, opened the records, cleared my mind, and let the numbers tell me what actually happened instead of what I had been told. The difference was that this time the account holder was me, and the subjects of the investigation were people whose handwriting I had known since childhood. The inconsistencies appeared faster than I expected. The transfer I had made for my mother's gallbladder surgery, $11,000, sent on a Tuesday in early April, had gone out 3 days before my parents checked into a resort property at Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. I still had the dates because my mother had sent me a photo from the trip, a sunset over the water, captioned with something about finally being able to relax after everything she'd been through. At the time, I had thought it was sweet that she was recovering somewhere peaceful. Now I was looking at the resort's check-in date stamped in the corner of the image and doing the math. The money I sent for her surgery had paid for that trip. The transfer for Mallory's legal fees landed on the same date she had put a down payment on an SUV. I found that one through a payment confirmation email she had accidentally forwarded to me months later, assuming I wouldn't look closely at the numbers. The furnace repair money went out in late March, which in Fort Collins is the kind of weather that doesn't require emergency heating. My mother had described frozen pipes and a house dropping below 50 degrees. The outdoor temperature that week had been in the mid-50s. I spent the next 2 days making quiet inquiries. I called the hospital my mother had named for her surgery and gave them the approximate date and her full name. No record. I called the clinic my father had referenced for his spinal treatment. No record matching his name or the treatment described. I contacted the law firm Mallory had supposedly hired. They had no client by her name on file for the relevant period. Each call took less than 5 minutes. Every single one came back empty. The guilt hit hardest not when I found the inconsistencies, but in the hours between finding them. I would close the laptop and sit with the silence and think about my father's face at Christmas 3 years ago, and wonder whether any of it had ever been real. Part of me kept reaching for a version of events where my parents had simply made poor decisions out of love for Mallory, where the deception had been reluctant, uncomfortable, something they felt bad about, even as they did it. But then I would remember my father's laugh, not guilty, not conflicted, satisfied, the laugh of someone who had found a system that worked. I moved all of my savings to a new account at a different bank before the week was out. I changed every password, enabled biometric authentication on all financial apps, and closed the joint account my parents and I had shared years ago when I first moved out, and they'd said it would make it easier to help with expenses. I had never questioned that arrangement. I questioned everything now. I also placed a fraud alert on my credit file. My father had known my social security number for years, and my mother still had a copy of my birth certificate somewhere in that house. After that, I called a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud cases involving family members. I explained the situation, sent her the recording, and asked her to hold a copy. I wasn't ready to file anything. I just needed someone outside of my family's reach to know what existed. 2 days after that, my mother called me crying and said my father had just had a serious cardiac event. When I arrived at my parents' house, my father was lying on the living room sofa with a blanket pulled up to his chest and a cheap pulse oximeter clipped to his finger, the kind you could order online for less than $20. Mallory was standing near the window with her arms crossed, her eyes red. My mother met me at the door and handed me a folder before I had even taken off my coat. The documents inside carried the logo of Rockland Cardiac Institute, a real cardiac center in Denver. According to the paperwork, my father required emergency bypass surgery within 48 hours. The total cost after insurance adjustments was $235,000. There was a payment link at the bottom of the last page with a deadline of midnight. My mother explained that they had sold the car and liquidated their retirement account, but were still far short of what was needed. Mallory crossed the room, took my hand, and said she could not live with herself if our father died because the family couldn't cover the bill. My father, lying on the sofa, reached up and gripped my wrist gently. He said he didn't want to be a burden. His voice was thin and rough in a way that I recognized not from any real illness, but from the recording I had listened to 6 times by then. I sat down and opened the folder. I worked through it the way I would have worked through any fraudulent document set methodically without showing what I was seeing. The patient identification code didn't follow Rockland's actual formatting structure. The attending physician's signature was identical across 2 different pages, which doesn't happen with handwritten signatures. The contact number listed for the billing department was different from the one I had saved directly from Rockland's official website the day before. The payment portal's registered address matched the business filing for Velvet Pine events. And the hospital's logo was slightly off, the proportions wrong, the color a shade too dark compared to the version on Rockland's actual website. I set the folder on the coffee table and looked at my father. Then I asked him in a completely neutral voice whether he could show me his most recent electrocardiogram results, since the folder only contained the surgical estimate and not the underlying diagnostic records. The room went quiet in a way that had its own texture. My father looked at my mother. My mother looked at Mallory. Nobody spoke for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. I told them I also wanted to call Rockland directly to confirm the surgical booking, using the number from their official website, because with an amount this large, I wanted to make sure everything was in order before I initiated any transfer. I took out my phone and pulled up the saved contact. Mallory's composure broke first. She said there was no time for this, that the surgeon was waiting, that every minute I spent asking questions was a minute my father didn't have. My father sat up from the sofa fully without difficulty and told me in a voice that was no longer thin or rough that this was not the moment for me to be difficult. The blanket slid off his lap. The pulse oximeter was still clipped to his finger. I put my phone down on the table and told them I wasn't going to transfer the money. I told them I had known about the plan before I walked through the door. Then I played the recording. My mother's voice filled the room. "Don't worry, we'll trick her like always." All 3 of them heard it. My father's jaw tightened. Mallory looked at the floor. My mother's expression shifted through several things in quick succession before settling into something careful and still. I walked them through what I had found. The surgery dates that aligned with vacations. The legal fees that matched a car purchase. The furnace repair billed in spring. The hospitals and clinics with no records. The $78,400 I had transferred across 4 years, and where the evidence suggested that money had actually gone. I laid it out the same way I would have presented findings to a client, plainly in sequence without editorializing. It was the only way I could get through it without my voice breaking. Mallory recovered her footing first. She said I had more than enough money and that helping family wasn't supposed to feel like a transaction. She said a real sister wouldn't be sitting here talking about documentation while her father was sick. My mother said I had always cared more about money than about the people in my life. My father said that everything they had done, everything was because they had no other options, and that children who were raised well understood what they owed their parents. I told them that owing someone your love was different from owing them your silence while they committed fraud. I told them I would not be sending $235,000. I would not be covering Mallory's debts, and I would not be available to absorb the consequences of decisions I had no part in making. I picked up the folder, took the documents with me as evidence, and left. What followed was methodical and deliberate. My mother called every relative and family friend whose number she had, and the story she told them contained no mention of fake hospital records or payment portals. What it contained was a father with a heart condition, a daughter in crisis, and an older sister who had chosen money over family. Within days, messages began arriving from people I hadn't spoken to in years, telling me I should be ashamed of myself. An aunt I had always been fond of sent a voicemail I couldn't bring myself to finish listening to. Mallory posted something on social media vague enough to avoid naming me directly, specific enough that anyone who knew us would understand exactly who she meant. My father called one night not long after. The weak, strained voice was gone. He spoke the way he always had when he wanted me to understand something was final low, and even with the particular weight of a man who considered himself the authority on what was reasonable. He told me my mother had stopped eating. He said that if the family fell apart, I would have to live with that. Then he ended the call before I could respond. It was such a practiced move, the silence he left behind had always been louder than anything he said out loud. I had decided not to go public with the evidence, partly because I still believed some version of privacy was owed to people I had loved, and partly because I knew that the moment any of this became visible, Mallory's situation would escalate into something criminal. My family read my restraint as weakness, and they pressed it. My mother walked into the lobby of Vantage Ledger Forensics one morning during a client meeting. I was told later that she stood near the reception desk, crying loudly, and asking for me by name, telling anyone within earshot that I was allowing my father to die rather than pay his medical bills. One of our largest long-term clients happened to be in the building. I had to excuse myself from the meeting to handle the situation. When security escorted my mother out, she said loudly enough for the lobby to hear that I could investigate strangers for a living, but didn't have the heart to take care of my own family. That afternoon, I handed our legal team the recording, the fraudulent documents, the billing portal registration under Velvet Pine Events, and a 4-year summary of my transaction history with annotations. I also sent a formal written notice to my parents and Mallory, requiring them to cease all contact with me and to refrain from appearing at my place of employment. Days later, my credit monitoring service sent an alert early in the morning. Someone had attempted to open a $90,000 loan in my name. The contact address on the application was my parents' house in Fort Collins. I called my father. He didn't deny it. He said my mother had given Mallory some of my old documents, a copy of my Social Security card, an outdated lease agreement with my full information on it. He said they had believed Mallory would pay the loan back before I noticed. He said they hadn't had a choice. I thought about what he'd said, we didn't have a choice, and I recognized it as the same sentence that had closed every conversation we'd ever had about money. It had always functioned less as an explanation and more as a door being shut. I reported the identity theft to the relevant agencies, froze my credit across all 3 bureaus, and sent everything to my lawyer that same morning. My family told the remaining relatives that I had reported my own sister to the authorities. Some of those relatives stopped speaking to me. I had protected every dollar I owned and lost the version of my family I had believed in for 32 years, and both of those things were true at the same time. When my company offered me a position at their new branch in Boise, Idaho, I accepted it the same day they asked. I was packed and out of Fort Collins in 3 weeks. Boise was smaller than Fort Collins in the ways that mattered when you didn't know anyone. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment near the office while I looked for something to buy, and for the first several weeks the quiet in the evenings was so complete that I didn't know what to do with it. I had spent so many years with my phone face up on the table, waiting for the next crisis, that the absence of urgency felt less like relief and more like a room with furniture missing. You keep walking around the spaces where things used to be. I noticed it most at night. No missed calls from unknown numbers. No texts that opened with "I hate to ask, but" or "something happened, and we need." No sense of low-level dread running underneath whatever I was trying to focus on. The stillness was real, and I didn't fully trust it yet. I kept checking my credit alerts. I kept my lawyer's number near the top of my contacts. I had protected everything I could protect, and I still slept like someone who expected the locks to fail. What helped unexpectedly was the work. The Boise branch was smaller, and the caseload was different. Fewer corporate clients, more individuals and small businesses, and a significant number of cases involving people who had been stolen from by someone they trusted personally. Adult children who had taken over an elderly parent's finances and helped themselves to decades of savings. Caregivers who had been added to accounts for convenience and had treated that access as an inheritance paid out early. Siblings listed as emergency contacts who had used that position to redirect insurance payments. I had always known this category of fraud existed. I had written reports about it. But I had never worked the cases up close, never sat across from the people who had been on the receiving end of it. I proposed building a dedicated unit for exactly this kind of case, and the branch director approved it within a week. I started small, 2 investigators and a shared paralegal, and we began taking referrals from elder law attorneys and family court mediators. The work was slower than corporate fraud. The evidence was often messier. The victims were frequently reluctant to formalize their complaints, because doing so meant saying out loud to a stranger in writing that someone they loved had stolen from them. I understood that reluctance in a way I hadn't before. I understood the specific arithmetic of it, the calculation you run almost without realizing it, where you weigh the truth against what the truth will cost you in terms of people and memory and the version of your own life you had believed in. I thought about my family often, but differently than I had expected to. I didn't think about them with the open grief I had anticipated. What I felt was more like the sensation of pressing on a bruise, specific, located, manageable, as long as I didn't press too hard. I thought about the dinners. I thought about Mallory at 12 years old making me laugh at the table over something I couldn't even remember anymore. I thought about the way my mother used to leave the porch light on when I drove back late. I thought about all of it, and then I thought about the folder of fraudulent documents sitting in my lawyer's files, and about the recording, and about my father's laugh, and the bruise would sharpen for a moment, and then settle back. The call from my father came on a Tuesday morning, 2 months after I had moved to Boise. The number was one I didn't recognize, not his usual cell, which I had blocked, but a different one entirely. I answered because I thought it might be work-related. He told me the investigation had moved forward. Mallory had been formally summoned by the district attorney's office in connection with the missing client deposits, the unpaid payroll taxes, and the fraudulent use of my identifying information. My mother was also being examined for her role in preparing the false medical documents. He said it without drama, the way he used to tell me something was non-negotiable, just a statement of facts delivered in a voice designed to communicate that the outcome was still mine to change. He asked me to tell the investigators that the identity theft had been a misunderstanding, a family matter that had been blown out of proportion. He said that if I would simply clarify my original statement, the consequences for my mother and Mallory might be reduced significantly. He said that Corinne was my mother and Mallory was my only sister, and that I needed to think carefully about what I was doing to this family. I asked him one question. I asked whether either my mother or Mallory had called me at any point to apologize for what they had done. Not to explain it, not to reframe it, not to ask me for something, just to say that they were sorry. He was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the particular quality of that silence, the one I had grown up interpreting as disappointment, the one that had shaped so many of my choices. Before I understood, it was a tool rather than a feeling. Then he said that families didn't need to apologize to each other. I had needed to hear him say exactly that. Not because it surprised me by then very little about my father could surprise me, but because it confirmed what I had suspected since he first called. They were not reaching out because something in them had shifted. They were reaching out because the strategy had changed, and they needed me to play a different role in it. The ask was new. The dynamic was identical. I told him I would not be retracting or modifying my statement. I told him that what happened next was the direct result of choices they had made, and that I was no longer available to absorb those consequences on their behalf. I ended the call, set the phone down on my desk, and sat with it for a minute before opening the case file I had been working on before he called. The investigation ran its course over the following months. The findings were not complicated, because the records were not complicated once someone looked at them without the benefit of the doubt. Mallory had used deposits from at least 11 couples to cover personal debts and operating costs for Velvet Pine events. Several of those couples had booked venues and vendors who had never been paid, and some of them had found out only weeks before their wedding dates. Velvet Pine Events was formally dissolved. Mallory's car was sold. Most of what she owned that had monetary value went toward satisfying the civil judgments against her. The criminal process moved more slowly as it tends to, but it moved. My mother was placed in a supervised compliance program and required to make partial restitution for her involvement in preparing the fraudulent documents. She was not charged with the identity theft directly, but the investigation established clearly that she had provided Mallory with my personal information. My father sold the house in Fort Collins. The property had been refinanced twice, which meant there was very little equity left, but what remained went toward satisfying the mortgage obligations and a portion of the outstanding financial judgments. He and my mother moved into a rental about 40 minutes outside the city. I didn't recover the full $78,400. The civil attorney told me early on that full recovery was unlikely, given what was actually left to recover, and she was right. I made peace with that faster than I expected, partly because the money had never been the thing I was most focused on. What I had been focused on, without always having the words for it, was the right to know what was real. That was the thing that had actually been taken from me over 4 years, and no judgment could return it. What I could do was stop letting it be taken any further. That fall, I bought a house in the North End neighborhood of Boise, a small brick place on a tree-lined street, older construction, a little worn in the ways that made it feel like somewhere a person actually lived, rather than somewhere they were waiting to leave. In the backyard, there was a detached structure that had been used as a storage space for years, with good bones, and enough square footage to be something else with some work. I hired a contractor in November, and by early spring it had been converted into a proper office, insulated, wired with 2 desks, and enough filing space to run a small operation independently if I ever chose to do that. I had been thinking about running something independently for years. Every time I had moved toward it, a phone call had come in, and the savings I had set aside for it had gone somewhere else instead. The office in the backyard was the first version of my own future that had made it all the way to completion. I put my name on the door. Not the company's name. Mine. Almost a year after I had left Fort Collins, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address. I recognized Mallory's handwriting on the front. I opened it at the kitchen table with my coffee still warm in front of me. She hadn't written to ask for anything. There was no request in the letter, no setup for one, no angle I could identify, even reading it twice carefully, looking for one. What she had written instead was an account of what she understood herself to have done. She said she had treated my generosity as a resource rather than a gift. She said she had let our parents convince her that my success meant I could afford to cover her failures, and she had found it easier to believe that than to stop making them. She wrote that the phrase, "we'll trick her like always," had once made her feel safe, because it had meant that whatever she broke, I would be made to fix. She said she now understood that the safety she had felt was built entirely on my damage. She didn't mention our parents. She didn't ask me to respond. The letter ended simply with her name. I read it twice and then set it on the table and looked out the window at the backyard for a while. I wasn't ready to call it forgiveness. I didn't know if that word would ever apply or if it needed to. What the letter was, as far as I could tell, was the first communication I had ever received from Mallory that wasn't designed to produce a specific response from me. She hadn't written it to make me feel guilty, or to make me feel sorry for her, or to move me toward doing something she needed. She had written it, as far as I could tell, because she had something to say. I put the letter in the drawer of my kitchen desk and left it there. That afternoon, I walked out to the backyard office and sat at my desk for a while without opening anything. Through the window, I could see the house, the yard, the small patch of garden I had started along the south fence. It was quiet, in the way that Boise had gradually become quiet to me, not the unsettling absence I had felt in those first weeks, but something more like actual stillness. The kind that belongs to you. Nobody was calling to tell me there was an emergency. Nobody was performing an illness in a room somewhere waiting for me to arrive with my checkbook and my willingness to believe the worst had happened. Nobody was sitting at a table planning the next version of a story designed to reach into my life and take something out of it. The silence in that backyard wasn't emptiness. It was what was left when all of that finally stopped. I had believed for a long time that losing my family would be the price of telling the truth. What I had learned slowly, and not without cost, was that the family I was afraid of losing had never quite existed, not in the form I had believed it did. What I had lost was the story I had been telling myself about them for 32 years. And what I had found in the space where that story used to be was a life that was actually mine. If this story made you think about the people in your life, about the difference between love and obligation, about how long you can believe something before the evidence becomes impossible to ignore, then you already know why these stories matter. None of us want to think that the people closest to us are capable of this. But knowing what it looks like is the first step to making sure it doesn't keep happening in silence. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. There are people out there who need to hear that they're not alone, and every share helps this reach them. Thank you for listening, all the way to the end. That means more than you know.